Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you.
Hello and welcome back to In a Nutshell. This is Bill Brush, and today I'm going to be talking and start a series of talks that are based on specific fertilization programs for different crops, be more crop specific. So I'm going to go off on several of these for the next several weeks. We'll start with something near and dear to my heart, which is almonds or almonds or almonds. Take out whatever flavor that you like, and they're all correct. Out here in California, we tend to call them almonds, but I'll try to refrain from that and call them almonds as much as I can. We've talked a lot about all the nutrients, talked a little bit about water. We've talked about several different components of soil samples and soil tests and what you want to do and how you want to do it. And today I want to show you a little bit of how you manufacture a growing season. So what should I be applying fertility-wise to my crop, an almond crop, for a 12-month cycle? And we're going to call them producing almonds because they are, it's easier to just lay out a generic, and then we'll go backwards maybe at the end and talk about while they're young and growing kind of what you need to do, because the nutrient requirement for those young trees is just not nearly what it is for producing mature orchard.
Now Bill's going to talk about what the first step is that you should do before developing your fertility program.
First thing you must assess before you put together your fertility program is, what do you think your yield goal is? If you have a very, very strong orchard and you want to say we're going to produce 3,000 pounds of meats per acre, that's a whole different fertility program than one that says I want to produce 2,000 pounds of nut meat. Or if we want to go higher and say I want to produce 4,000 pounds. But just because we predict it and say we want to, we have to have things in place to be able to perform on those trees so that they can reach those numbers. But I think a good place to start is somewhere around 3,000 pounds. And it's kind of what I use as a standard. And remember, you can always back off, but you can't catch up. And I'll stress that a lot with a lot of fertility programs. If you wait and say, well, I'm going to try to catch up and put all my fertilizer on now, it's never going to be as successful as it will be if you start from scratch, from right off the get-go, and say, okay, we're going to go for 3,000 pounds, and that's the way we're going to fertilize. And at some point when we look at those trees and recognize there either is more or less, then we have to adjust our fertility program for that. The first thing when you talk about fertility, it really starts the year before, right after harvest, and putting on some post-harvest fertilizer right after you get done with that last, pickup of your last load of nuts, and then irrigation, and then putting on some post-harvest fertility. Primarily those things that can't be stored up in the soil, nitrogen being a primary one. And then we also, because of the demand that almonds have for potassium, we also like to put some potassium out. But the one we need to really get on is the nitrogen. And I recommend a couple of different varieties. There's urea ammonium nitrate 32% or UN32, or another product I like a lot is ammonium sulfate. One's a dry and one's a liquid. If you've got an irrigation system and you just got done with harvest, you'll probably want to go ahead and put that UN32 on. It's much easier, much more convenient, and gets it done. It gives you somewhere, you want to apply about 20% of your entire supply of nitrogen, which is depending on what level you want to. But if you're going for 3,000 pounds, you need to put about 50 pounds of nitrogen, or about 14 gallons of UN32, or 250 pounds of ammonium sulfate per acre. Once that's applied, you're going to come back and we'll start with our nitrogen program. We'll kind of put together how we want to do that.
Now Bill's going to explain the time frame in which it takes for nutrients, specifically nitrogen, but all nutrients, to get from the root tips to the growing tips.
start in January before bloom even comes out. A lot of people think it's way too early. But remember that nitrogen or any nutrient picked up by the roots takes about a 30 to 40 day cycle to go from the time it enters into that plant till the time it gets to the growing tips. So if we're doing something in January, we're really looking for February as to when that plant's going to really truly be utilizing it. And then right in February, that's when we have massive amounts of pollination. We're starting to get leaf buds breaking through, showing tissue, starting to grow. Right behind that, you're going to have to try to grow these nuts, push out leaves, set these nuts. All of this takes place. So if you're lagging behind and waiting till late February when you're in the middle of bloom or beyond, or into March after bloom's kind of over, you've kind of missed a target where you can get needed nitrogen on the front end of this bloom.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about one of his favorite products to use, which is ammonium sulfate.
I like to use at this one, this is my standard product I love to use, which is ammonium sulfate. And one thing I really like to do is it's got sulfur, which if you've had a reasonable amount of rainfall, 12 to 15 inches, you'll be starting with almost no sulfur available in your soil. And if you look back at your old soil samples that you took at the end of last year, you can also say, well, we had almost nothing then. That means you'll really be low. So it's great to start off with an application of sulfur and also with ammonium type nitrogen because it's not leaching. So if you're worried that you're going to get rainfall before things get there, well, the thing you'll see is that ammonium will be tied up in that first inch and a half until soil temperatures start to get a little warmer. And at that point, then it'll turn to nitrate. But in the short term, in that later January and into early February, it'll stay in that ammonium stage. Then somewhere around the first week of February up to about February 10th, I love to put in CAN 17. And I like to put about 3 applications somewhere about 2 weeks apart. Okay. So somewhere on we'll just say February 10th, and then somewhere around February 28th, the end of February, and then about March 15th. Those 3 applications are really to get 2 forms of nitrogen, ammonium and nitrate nitrogen, and in the presence of calcium, which makes their uptake much better, and the efficiency with sulfur. All of these are leading to more efficient uptakes of nitrogen in this early season. You need a massive amount of nitrogen uptake, so we're really spiking it during that 6-week period where you're getting nitrogen in both forms and in a readily available form. Also, that soluble calcium is going to help filling the cells, the vacuoles of the cells as they begin to enlarge, the nuts, the leaves. So getting that extra soluble calcium in is going to be also real helpful. Now, if we start around the 1st of April, then it doesn't really make any difference what we do for nitrogen. We use probably the easiest and cheapest form, which normally lately has been UN32. If you find a cheaper form, use it. But if not, UN32 works nice, and we put on over the next 3 to 4 weeks, we'll be putting on somewhere in the neighborhood of another 70 pounds of nitrogen, about 10 gallons of UN32, a couple of times. Into May, we'll probably put a third, and then we'll look, if necessary, we'll put on a fourth if needed. Now, what these are is we're looking all along, but if we get here to mid-March and we've had terrible bloom weather, we all of a sudden will start to really slow down the nitrogen flow into the plant because it's had a lot of uptake of nitrogen and not any ability to fill nuts. And so it's not using anything for that hull or shell or nut. And so that nitrogen is going to go to growth. So if we keep pounding it, you're going to get a really, really whippy tree with lots and lots of foliage and not any nuts on it. And we want to grow good, solid growth.
Now Bill's going to talk about when and why he likes to stop his nitrogen program towards the end of the growing season.
So that's kind of the nitrogen program. And then we're back to post-harvest. And I like to stop that nitrogen during the growing season in mid to late May. One of the reasons is, remember what I said, that means that nitrogen is going to arrive at the growing tips somewhere around mid to late June. Well, now we're into July. We're getting the hull split, bud differentiation. All of those things are happening in June and July. And we have all of those nutrients there. That nitrogen is there for those two events. If we continue to fertilize later with nitrogen, now we're getting in and we're interfering with hull split. We're interfering with maturity because you're signaling that tree to continue to grow. And so this is why somewhere mid to no later than the end of May do I want any nitrogen going out.
Now, Bill's going to talk about the role that potassium has in growing almonds.
Almonds are a large potassium user, and there's a big sink of potassium in that tree. And one of the things about potassium is that in most cases, you're going to be well served by having multiple applications. And I like to break it up to somewhere in post-harvest, we can put in our first application, about a third of our potassium. And you're going to need somewhere in the neighborhood of 240, 250 pounds of actual K. Now, sulfate of potash is 50% potassium, so you're going to need, at that rate, you're going to need somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 pounds if we're going to get to that 3,000 pound goal. Again, we have opportunities. That's why we don't put it all on. One, it doesn't work as well. And two, we can't pick it back up once we put it out there. So we have 1/3 of it goes on at post-harvest. In the spring, another dry application. And what spring? Somewhere, I would say April's a good month. You have a pretty good idea of when what you have, and it's a good time to get it out. And then the last one is somewhere starting in first part of June to the middle of June, putting on liquid. And you can use a product. There's several different really good quality. One of the probably most prevalent you see is KTS. But there's other ones out there very, very good. And we want to put about a third of our potassium that way. And we start putting that on for maturity and also to keep those limbs good and strong as we've maximized weight now. And we want to continue to build on that potassium. And we don't want that tree to pull back potassium from our nuts. So that's why we continue to we'll just use KTS as an example. We'll probably put on something like, 5 gallons a week for somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 weeks. Now we're going to be closing in on harvest.
Now, Bill's going to touch on phosphate.
The other one of the big three nutrients of N, P, and K, and the fourth one being sulfur, but the third one that we want to talk next is phosphate. And phosphate, if you're going to put any on, early is when it needs to be. Unless you're completely devoid of phosphate, and this is probably a good time to go back to that. When we're talking about all of these things, none of this program will be successful unless it started with a good soil test. Because then we're beginning to fill in the things that we don't have in our fertility program. We know how strong the soil is, how much nutrients are held there, and then we're able to fill back in. There might be such a thing depending on what happened the year before or what this ground has been in or what's in your water, all kinds of things that you may adjust all of these things. But we don't know that without a good soil test. So that's why we can come back and when we come back to phosphate, if we have lots and lots of phosphate in the soil, it might be helpful to put a little boost early on. Really nice available phosphate. You only need 3 to 5 gallons of a very, very good. We'll say I know there's a 324-5, which is an NP and K, and it's a real good one. There's Agri Liquids. There's several different companies that have really good products. Those don't get tied up in the soil because they're chelated, and so the plant has a really good opportunity to pick that up and get it started. And once it gets a little phosphate, those roots really expand and seek other phosphate and get it into the plant. But on almonds, that only use maybe about 25 pounds on a 3,000 pound crop of actual removal of P. So it's not a huge removal, but there is a lot used. And then it's recycled.
Now Bill's going to talk a little bit about sulfur.
And then on sulfur, with what you put on an ammonium sulfate, and then you come back with SOP, you're going to meet that requirement because you want to put about 100 pounds of sulfate sulfur per acre throughout the season. because if we can keep our number up around 50 parts per million or 50 pounds per acre, it's going to be really, really beneficial. One, you'll get more efficiency on your nitrogen uptakes, at least 10% better efficiency. It'll also put in sugars and starches into the nut, make them even weigh a little bit heavier, those kind of things. And it's the fourth most important nutrient for a reason. So that's kind of in by all of the things that we talked about, the putting on the ammonium sulfate, maybe sulfate of potash. There's enough sulfur in there to keep it going throughout the year. It's good to have multiple applications of sulfur because it's a leachable nutrient. It's negatively charged. It's not held on the soil colloid. So the irrigation over the year keeps moving it through. So you put all the sulfur on at one time, it's not near as successful as putting it out through the year.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about his famous micronutrients.
Last, I'll talk about the micronutrients, because if you haven't got everything else I've talked about right, micronutrients are going to be insignificant. They're very big helpers, and look for those, and you'd find those in a good soil test, the extreme deficiencies. And those you want maybe to build up, if your budget will allow for that, to actually put on some manganese sulfate or a little bit of boron in granulabore, or zinc sulfate, or copper sulfate. All of these things will be very helpful to your program if you've got that money. And those can be applied in the wintertime and get them out of the way, get them incorporated. They don't leach, so you're going to have them there throughout the growing season.
Now Bill's going to talk about foliars.
And then the next thing is, if that budget doesn't allow, then you can make up a little bit of that difference by foliar. And you can put that on at full bloom. Is one I like too, because I start to have some tissue exposed. I like to see tissue. It's my opinion that that's the best time to put foliars on. And then somewhere 5 to 6 weeks later, after petal fall, come in with another application when you're usually, and you can usually piggyback those with a fungicide spray in almonds. So that's a good place to put them on. If you're not able to do any building by budget, then I would recommend you bump these rates on your foliars to what's the recommended rate or the top of the label rate, because you're going to need the nutrients, but it's not going to be able to get as much from the soil. So it's a little better to beef it up a little bit on what you put on. Like if the standard rate's 1 to 2 quarts and the max rate is 3 to 4, you might want to be pushing the 3 to 4 if you're not able to put any building numbers. Foliars are really good helpers. They don't substitute for what you can get out of the soil. And the pound, I always like to tell people the pounds come from the soil and the parts per million come from foliars. Remember, what you spray, some of it does get on the soil. In fact, the earlier you spray, the more of it gets on the soil. So it can be utilized a little bit there, but it's an expensive way to apply soil applied nutrients if they're foliars onto the soil.
Now Bill's going to cap off the conversation with talking about why it's so important to have good and efficient irrigation.
And then the last thing, and all of this is really good, it's a sound program, it'll do really well for you. But if you don't back that up with good, efficient irrigation, so that you're allowing these nutrients to be available the maximum amount of time, because if you're too wet, they aren't taken up. If they're too dry, they don't get taken up. And so right in between there is where we want to keep it. We have a mixture of even amounts of water and air, which is 25% water and 25% air of that soil mass. At that point, that's the ideal place for nutrients to pick up. So a little before that and a little bit after that's what you want to shoot. Our modern irrigation systems allow us to do a whole lot of things better than we used to be able to maintain this right at that optimum level. So with a good fertility program and knowing what to do from good soil tests and a really robust, good, solid irrigation system, I think you can look forward to some really good crops following this program. Till next time, thanks for listening.
Thanks for another fantastic episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure everyone very much so appreciated what you had to say and your thoughts on how to maintain and set up a good fertility program for almonds. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and always stay curious.